James Thompson stood on the platform of the empty train station, the fog thickening around him. It was the kind of fog that swallowed the world whole, leaving nothing but shadows and fleeting whispers of memories. He shivered slightly in his worn-out brown coat, feeling the weight of sleepless nights etched on his tired blue eyes. As he approached the ticket counter, he noticed how the attendant moved with mechanical precision, almost indifferent to his presence. The exchange was brief. James did not even bother asking about the destination. He knew he needed to get away, needed something to break the loop of restless regrets that had been tormenting him. The train itself seemed misplaced, an antique with dark wooden panels and flickering yellow lights. It was almost as though it had stepped out of a forgotten era into the present, just for him. James hesitated for a moment before boarding, a strange compulsion pulling him forward. He took a seat near the window, watching the station disappear behind him as the train lurched into motion, swallowed by the fog. The carriage was dimly lit, the velvet upholstery worn, and the air carried a sense of melancholy. He glanced around, noting the few other passengers, most of whom were shrouded in shadows. There was a sense of familiarity that gnawed at him, but he couldn't quite place it. Across the aisle, he caught sight of a young man, a younger version of himself. James blinked, shaken by the sight. The young man had bright eyes filled with optimism, eyes James remembered once having himself. The young man looked at him, smiled briefly, then turned away, leaving James with an uncomfortable knot in his chest. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels lulled James into a trance, thoughts drifting to moments in his life that he had tried to bury. The choices he made, the mistakes that haunted him, the people he left behind. His gaze shifted back to the young man across the aisle. The smile on that face was a haunting reminder of everything James used to be before the disappointments, the shattered dreams, and the betrayals. He shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could change seats, wishing he could outrun himself. A sudden presence loomed over him, a dark figure, the train conductor. He wore a uniform reminiscent of a different era, his face obscured by the dim light. The conductor leaned in, his gaze heavy as he scrutinized James's ticket. There was a moment of silence before the conductor spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. It's a one-way journey for those who aren't ready to return. The words struck James like a blow. He looked up, meeting the conductor's shadowed gaze, but the man turned away, moving down the aisle without another word. An unsettling chill settled over James, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this train than he first thought. James stood, his legs feeling heavy, and decided to head towards the dining car, hoping a drink might steady his nerves. As he walked down the aisle, he passed by a woman, a striking figure with dark, wavy hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to look straight through him. She watched him intently, her gaze unwavering. James looked away quickly, feeling his heartbeat quicken. There was something in her eyes, something that made him feel as if she knew every secret he had tried to keep hidden. The dining car was dim, opulent, with red velvet drapes and tarnished chandeliers. James took a seat, glancing at the untouched meals set out on the tables, the stillness almost unsettling. He ordered a drink, the liquid burning as it slid down his throat, bringing a fleeting sense of warmth. He was about to take another sip when the woman with the green eyes appeared, seating herself across from him as though they were old acquaintances. "Running never gets you far," she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that made James put his glass down. He looked at her, frowning, unsure of what to say. She smiled faintly, leaning back. "It's always there, isn't it?" The regret, the what ifs, James swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Do I know you?" he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman's eyes softened, though there was a sadness behind them. "You used to," she replied. "Or maybe you knew someone like me. Someone you left behind." She paused, watching the way James's expression faltered. "It's a hard thing facing the past." James felt his pulse quicken, a sense of unease clawing at him. He stood abruptly, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. "I need some air," he muttered, leaving the dining car before she could say another word. He found himself at the observation deck, the wind cold against his face, the fog pressing in around the train. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels was louder here, the emptiness around him amplifying the sound. James leaned against the railing, closing his eyes, trying to steady his breath. But the wind carried whispers, fragments of voices, his daughter's voice, young and innocent, calling out for him. James opened his eyes, his heart aching. He saw her, Clara, a young version of her, waiting by a window, looking out as if hoping for someone who never came. The vision brought a sharp pain to his chest, and he gripped the railing, the regret almost overwhelming. He had missed so much her birthdays, her laughter, her tears. All the moments he chose something else over her, all the times he ran instead of staying. "Running never brought you peace," a voice said, soft yet clear. James turned, seeing the woman again, Elena, standing there, her expression filled with empathy. He looked at her, tears blurring his vision. "What is this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why am I here?" Elena stepped closer, her gaze gentle. "This train, James, is a passage, a place between what was and what could be. You're here to face the truth you've been running from." James shook his head, the weight of her words pressing on him. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "There's too much. Too much I've done wrong." Elena reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We all have regrets, James. But the choice is still yours, face them or remain lost." The train whistle blew, the sound echoing into the night, and James felt something shift within him. He looked out at the fog, then back at Elena. She was right. He couldn't keep running, not anymore. He had to confront the choices he made, the people he hurt, the dreams he abandoned. He took a deep breath, nodding, a new resolve settling within him. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll face it." Elena smiled, her eyes glistening with something that looked almost like pride. "Then let's go back inside," she said softly. "There's still more to see." James turned, following her back into the train, his steps slow but deliberate. He knew this journey would not be easy. He knew it would mean facing the very worst parts of himself. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than regret. He felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to make things right. James moved through the dim corridor of the train, his footsteps echoing faintly against the old wooden floor. The flickering lights above added to the sense of unease, as though the very train itself was aware of the journey he was about to undertake. He made his way back to the dining car, a heavy feeling in his chest that he could no longer ignore. He needed answers, and more than that, he needed to understand why he was here. As he entered the dining car, he saw his younger self sitting there, his gaze focused on something distant, beyond the confines of the train. The sight of young James was both haunting and painfully nostalgic. James approached the table, feeling a mix of dread and inevitability. He took a seat across from his younger self, the silence between them stretching until it felt almost unbearable. Young James turned his head slowly, those bright, optimistic eyes now staring directly into James's. There was no recognition in them, only disappointment. "You gave up," young James said, his voice sharp, like a blade cutting through the quiet. His lips curled slightly in what might have been a sneer. "You had all these dreams, all these plans, and you threw them away." James swallowed, the words sinking deep. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The younger version of himself seemed to grow more agitated, his expression hardening. "You had potential, you know. You could have been someone. You could have made a difference, but instead, you ran. You ran from every opportunity, every challenge." James lowered his gaze, unable to meet those eyes any longer. It hurt to hear the truth, to have it thrown back at him by a version of himself who still believed in something better. I made mistakes," James finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was scared. I didn't know how to deal with the failures." Young James shook his head, leaning back in his seat, his expression full of frustration. "You were scared, and so you ran. But what did you achieve by running? Look where it's gotten you, sitting on this ghost train, alone, filled with regrets." James felt a surge of emotions, anger, guilt, shame, all battling within him. He clenched his hands into fists, staring at his younger self. "You think it was easy," he said, his voice trembling. "Life isn't what you think it is. It's not just about dreams and ambitions. Sometimes you lose people. Sometimes you make choices that you can't undo." "I did what I could to survive," young James scoffed, shaking his head. "Surviving isn't living, James. You settled for less because it was easier than fighting. You settled for a life filled with regret because you were too afraid to face yourself." James felt tears stinging his eyes, the weight of his younger self's words bearing down on him. He knew it was true. He had let fear dictate his life, let it push him away from everything that mattered. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Maybe I can't change the past," he said slowly, "but I can still try to make things right. I can still try to face what I've done." Young James stared at him for a long moment before his expression softened slightly. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "It's not too late, you know. You might have lost a lot, but there's still time. There's still something worth fighting for." James opened his eyes, meeting the gaze of his younger self, and he nodded. "I know," he said, his voice firmer, "and I'm going to try." The younger version of himself faded, leaving James alone in the dining car. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted. He knew this journey was far from over, but at least now, he felt a sense of purpose and need to confront the ghosts of his past. Suddenly, the train lurched, the lights dimming even further. James looked out the window, noticing that the fog had thickened. The train was slowing down, and through the haze, he could see an old, abandoned station coming into view. The train came to a stop, the silence almost deafening. James stood, hesitating for a moment before making his way to the exit. He stepped off the train, the cold night air hitting him, the scent of damp earth and old wood surrounding him. The station was deserted, the gas lamps flickering, casting long shadows across the cracked tiles. James walked along the platform, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He paused, a vision forming before him, his life as it could have been. He saw himself standing beside Clara, his daughter, her face lit with joy as they laughed together. He saw a version of himself who didn't run, who stayed, who fought for his family. The vision brought a sharp pain to his chest, the realization of everything he could have had but lost overwhelming him. James closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. The regret was almost too much to bear, but he knew he couldn't stay here, in this place of last opportunities. He took a deep breath, turning back towards the train. He stepped back on board, the door closing behind him, sealing up the vision of what could have been. He knew he had to keep moving forward, that he had to find a way to make amends, to reconcile with his past. As he walked down the corridor, he saw Elena waiting for him, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to sit, and he obliged, taking a seat across from her. There was a silence between them before she finally spoke, her voice soft. "You've started to see it, haven't you? The impact your choices had not just on you, but on those around you." James nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I see it now. I see the people I hurt, the lives I affected because I was too scared to face the consequences of my actions." Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with empathy. "The journey doesn't end until you understand the full extent of it, James. You have to see the pain you caused, not just in yourself, but in those you loved." James swallowed, the weight of her words pressing on him. "I'm ready," he said quietly. "I'm ready to face it all." Elena gave a faint smile, her eyes glistening. "It won't be easy. But it's the only way forward." James took a deep breath, nodding. He knew that the hardest part was yet to come. He would have to face Clara, to see the sadness in her eyes, to hear the words that would cut him deeper than anything he had faced so far. But he also knew that if he wanted any chance of redemption, if he wanted to truly live again, he had to face it all. The train began to move again, the fog outside shifting as the landscape blurred. James sat back, his heart heavy but resolute. He was on this journey for a reason, and he wouldn't run anymore. He would face his past, no matter how painful, and he would do everything in his power to make things right. And as the train glided forward into the unknown, James felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could still find a way back to those he loved. The carriage door closed behind James with a heavy clunk, and he found himself in an unfamiliar part of the train. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall, imposing, and reflecting his wan face at every angle. James stepped forward hesitantly, his image multiplying, filling the space around him until it felt like there was no escape. Each reflection was a reminder of what he had become, of the life he had lived and the mistakes that had aged him. He stared into the nearest mirror, his tired blue eyes meeting his own, but there was something more, a flicker of the past in the glass, a vision of another time. Suddenly, the reflections shifted. The mirrors no longer showed just his present self, but moments from his past, snapshots of pivotal decisions that had altered his life. There he was, standing in the hospital corridor, his wife crying in the room behind him, and James turning his back, walking away from it all. He saw himself in a dim apartment, bottles strewn around, the phone ringing of the hook with calls he refused to answer. There was Clara, a little girl with wide, innocent eyes, standing at the window, waiting for a father who never came. James reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold glass, as if he could somehow change the scenes playing before him. But they remained unmoving, a reflection of his regrets, the pain he had inflicted not only on others but on himself. He swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill over. He clenched his hands into fists, forcing himself to keep watching, to confront what he had spent years trying to forget. The air in the carriage seemed to grow colder, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. And then, out of the corner of his eye, James saw movement, young James stepping out from the shadows, his face filled with anger. He looked different now, his eyes no longer bright with optimism, but hardened, his expression filled with fury. James turned to face him, his heart pounding. "Why did you do it?" Young James demanded, his voice echoing through the carriage. "Why did you throw everything away? Your family, your dreams, everything we wanted. You let fear control you, let it take everything from us." James took a step back, the intensity of the confrontation making it hard to breathe. I was scared," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I was doing what was best." Young James's face twisted with rage. "You thought abandoning the people who loved you was best? You thought running away was the answer?" He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "You could have fought for them. You could have stayed. But you were too much of a coward." James felt the words cut into him like knives, his heart aching. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I was wrong. I know I should have stayed, should have been there for them. But I can't change it now." Young James shook his head, his expression filled with disappointment. "No, you can't change it. But you can decide if you're going to keep running or if you're finally going to face what you've done." James closed his eyes, the weight of his younger self's words bearing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. When he opened his eyes again, young James was gone, leaving him alone with his reflections. James turned to face the mirrors, looking at each one, seeing the moments that had shaped him. He knew that he could no longer run from them. He had to confront them, to accept the pain he had caused, and to find a way to make amends. The door at the end of the carriage opened, and James turned, seeing Elena standing there. Her green eyes were filled with sadness as she looked at him, her gaze holding his. She gestured for him to follow, and James did, his steps slow but deliberate. They moved into the next carriage, the mirrors behind him now a fading memory. Elena led him to a seat, and James sank into it, feeling the exhaustion of the journey so far. She sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his. There was a long silence before she spoke, her voice gentle. "You faced a part of yourself that you've been hiding from for a long time, James. It's not easy, but it's the only way forward." James nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I've spent so long running, pretending that I didn't care, that it didn't hurt. But it does. It always has." Elena reached out, placing a hand on his. Her touch was warm, a comfort against the cold that seemed to permeate the train. "There's still more to face," she said softly. "The choices you made didn't just hurt you. They hurt the people who loved you, the people who needed you. You need to see that, to understand the full impact of what happened." James looked at her, fear flickering in his eyes. "What if I can't? What if I can't face it all? What if it's too much?" Elena's gaze softened, her expression filled with empathy. "Then you'll stay here, forever traveling the tracks of regret. But if you want to live again, if you want a chance at redemption, you have to keep going." James swallowed hard, the enormity of her words pressing down on him. He knew she was right. He couldn't go back to who he was, couldn't keep running from the truth. He had to keep moving forward, no matter how painful it was. He had to see it all, to face the consequences of his actions, and to find a way to make things right. The train began to move again, the gentle rocking lulling James into a state of uneasy calm. He looked out the window, the fog thick and unyielding, and he wondered what lay ahead. He knew he wasn't alone. Elena was with him, guiding him, and that gave him a sliver of hope. But he also knew that the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. Suddenly, the door to the carriage opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was Clara. She looked just as he remembered her, a teenager with long, straight blonde hair, her bright blue eyes filled with sadness. James's heart clenched at the sight of her, the guilt almost unbearable. She stood there, her gaze locking onto his, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. Clara stepped forward, her expression unreadable, and James stood, his legs unsteady. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Clara stalked in front of him, her eyes searching his, and James felt his heart break all over again. He had abandoned her, had left her to face the world without him, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Tears filled his eyes, and he sank to his knees, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I thought you would be better off without me, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." Clara looked down at him, her expression softening, though the sadness remained. She knelt in front of him, reaching out to touch his face. "I waited for you," she said, her voice trembling. "I waited for so long, hoping you would come back, but you never did." James felt the tears spill over, his heart aching. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I failed you. I failed everyone. But I want to make it right. I want to be there for you now, if you'll let me." Clara stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, and then she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "You have a lot to make up for, Dad," she said softly, "but maybe it's not too late." James felt a surge of hope, his heart lifting for the first time in what felt like years. He reached out, pulling Clara into his arms, holding her tightly as the train moved forward, the fog outside beginning to part. He knew there was still a long way to go, still so much to face, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the life he had lost. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels echoed through the carriage as James sat opposite Clara, her bright blue eyes filled with sadness that weighed heavily on his heart. The train moved through an endless fog, and the dim light inside the carriage cast long, flickering shadows. There was a stillness between them, a silence that carried the burden of all the words left unsaid for years. James could feel the distance between them, the distance that had been growing ever since the day he left. Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable, and James felt his chest tighten. He wanted to bridge the gap between them, to reach out and take her hand, but he wasn't sure if he had the right. After all, he had been the one to create this chasm in the first place. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "You left us," she said, her eyes glistening. "You left me and Emma. You made us feel like we weren't worth fighting for. I waited for you, hoping you'd come back, but you never did." James swallowed hard, tears blurring his vision. He could feel the pain in her voice, the hurt that he had caused, and it crushed him. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know I failed you, Clara. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought that I was the problem, and that you'd be better off without me." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, and she shook her head. "You were wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "All I wanted was my dad. All I wanted was for you to stay and be there for me. You weren't perfect, but you were mine, and you just left." James felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart aching. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know how to handle my own failures. I felt like I couldn't be the man you and your MOM needed me to be. I thought leaving would be less painful for you. But I see now that I only made things worse. Clara looked at him, her expression softening just slightly, the anger giving way to the sadness underneath. You hurt me, Dad. You hurt me more than anyone ever has. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that. James's heart sank, and he lowered his gaze, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He had known this moment would come, had known he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But hearing it from Clara's lips cut deeper than anything he had imagined. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. I understand, he said quietly. I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I promise you, Clara, that if you'll give me the chance, I'll spend every day of my life trying to make up for what I did. I want to be here for you now, in any way that you'll let me. There was a long silence, the train's movement the only sound in the background. Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to determine whether he was sincere. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's not that easy, she said, her voice soft. You can't just come back and expect everything to be okay. It's going to take time if it ever happens at all. James nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. I know, he said. I'm not asking for it to be easy. I am just asking for the chance to try. Clara looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. She didn't say anything for a long time, and James waited, his breath caught in his throat. Then finally, she looked up at him, her eyes still sad but no longer filled with anger. Maybe, she said quietly, maybe we can try, but it's going to take a lot. James felt a rush of emotion, his chest tightening, and he reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before Clara placed her hand in his. He held it gently, as if afraid she might pull away. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me a chance. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Just don't let me down again, she said, her voice barely audible. James squeezed her hand, his heart breaking and healing all at once. I won't, he promised. I won't. The train continued its journey, the fog outside slowly beginning to thin, and James felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Suddenly, the door to the carriage opened, and James looked up to see Elena standing there, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and pride. She nodded to Clara, her gaze softening before shifting to James. It's time, she said simply. James looked at Clara, who gave him a small nod. He stood, his hand lingering on Clara's for a moment longer before he let go and followed Elena out of the carriage. The outside was cold, the fog thick once again as the train began to slow. James felt his heart pounding, the anticipation building within him. Elena led him to the end of the train, where an open platform awaited. The fog was dense, swirling around them like a living thing, and James could feel the weight of what was coming. He looked at Elena, his eyes questioning. She gave him a sad smile, her green eyes meeting his. This is your choice, James, she said softly. The train has taken you as far as it can. You have to decide now, do you stay here, traveling the tracks of regret forever, or do you find the strength to step off and live? James looked out into the fog, the unknown stretching before him. He thought of everything he had seen on this journey, the versions of himself, the mistakes, the people he had hurt. He thought of Clara, of her eyes filled with sadness and hope. And he knew what he had to do. He took a deep breath, turning to Elena. I want to live, he said, his voice steady. "I want to make things right." Elena's eyes glistened with emotion, and she nodded. "Then go, James. Step off the train and face the world again. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it." James felt a rush of emotion, tears filling his eyes. He looked at Elena, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything," Elena smiled, her expression bittersweet. "Go, James. It's time for you to live." James took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he stepped forward. The fog seemed to part, revealing a faint glimmer of light in the distance. He took another step, then another, until he was no longer on the train, but standing on solid ground, the fog slowly lifting around him. He turned back, but the train was gone, leaving only the echo of its whistle fading into the night. James felt a strange sense of peace, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He looked ahead, the light growing brighter, and he knew that this was just the beginning. He had a long way to go, a lot to make up for, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. He would find Clara, he would make amends, and he would live truly live. And as he took his first step toward the future, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The dawn was breaking, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. James found himself standing on solid ground, the train's whistle fading into the distance as the fog began to dissipate around him. The cold, damp air of the early morning wrapped around his frame, but there was a warmth beginning to build inside him, a warmth that came not from the air, but from the hope that had been reignited in his heart. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crispness of dawn, and felt the heaviness that had sat on his shoulders for so long begin to lift, inch by inch. He looked down at the small gift he held in his hands, a simple but meaningful token, something he knew Clara had once cherished, but had been left behind when he walked away. It was a reminder of the promises he made, and the chance to finally fulfill them. With every step away from the abandoned tracks, James could feel his feet growing more sure, each one planting itself more firmly on the path toward reconciliation. As he walked through the still sleeping town, memories surfaced, scenes of moments long lost, the joy and laughter that had once filled his life. He saw Clara as a child, her tiny hand in his as they walked through the park, her eyes lighting up at every bird and flower. He saw the disappointment in her gaze as she grew older, her excitement dimming each time he broke a promise or let her down. The weight of those memories had always been unbearable, but now they spurred him forward. The time to dwell on what was lost had ended. Now was the time to rebuild what could still be saved. James finally reached Clara's street. He stopped for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest as doubt crept in. Would she even want to see him? Could he really make things right after all these years? He clenched the small gift in his hand, letting its significance remind him of why he was here. He couldn't allow fear to hold him back any longer. He had chosen to live, to fight for a place in his daughter's life, and no matter the outcome, he knew he had to try. The house was modest, its garden neat but sparse, and the lights inside were dim, suggesting the early hour had caught its inhabitants still at rest. James hesitated, his hand hovering just above the doorbell. A deep breath, and then he pressed it, the chime ringing out into the quiet of dawn. He waited, his pulse quickening with every passing second. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, revealing Clara, her hair disheveled and her eyes tired. She blinked, clearly startled to see him standing there. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze filled with surprise and confusion, mixed with something else, something vulnerable that made James's chest tighten. "Dad?" she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James swallowed hard, nodding. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice trembling. I know it's early, and I know you probably weren't expecting this, but I wanted to see you. I needed to see you." Clara stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to discern whether this was real or some strange dream she was having. Finally, she stepped back, opening the door wider, and James felt a rush of relief. He stepped inside, the warmth of the home enveloping him. He followed Clara into the living room, the familiar scent of her home hitting him, a mix of lavender and something faintly sweet, something comforting. Clara gestured for him to sit, her eyes never quite meeting his, as if she was afraid of what she might see there. James sat down, the small gift still clutched in his hands. There was a long silence, the tension palpable. James could feel Clara's hesitancy, the wall she had built up over the years to protect herself from the hurt he had caused. He knew that breaking through those walls would take time, but he was ready to do whatever it took. He held out the gift, his hand trembling slightly. "I brought you something," he said, his voice soft. "I know it's not enough, not nearly enough, but I wanted to give this back to you. It was yours, something you loved, and I thought you should have it." Clara looked at the gift, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized it, a small music box, its once bright paint now chipped and faded. She took it from his hands, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest of moments. She opened the box, and the soft melody that had once been a lullaby filled the room, the notes clear but tinged with nostalgia. Tears filled her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, her lips trembling. "I thought this was lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe you still have it." James felt his own eyes welling with tears, and he nodded. "I kept it," he said, his voice thick. "I kept it because it reminded me of you. It reminded me of what I lost, of what I threw away. And I wanted to give it back to you, because I want to be a part of your life again, if you'll let me." Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his, and James could see the conflict in her gaze, the desire to let him in, mixed with the fear of being hurt again. He could see her struggling with the decision, and he knew that he had to be patient, that he had to earn her trust. "I know I can't change what happened," he continued, his voice steady. "I know I can't take away the pain I caused, but I want to try, Clara. I want to make things right, to be here for you in the way I should have been all along." Clara looked down at the music box, her fingers gently tracing the faded paint. There was a long silence, the only sound the soft melody still playing from the box. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You really hurt me, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "You left me when I needed you most. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." James nodded, his heart aching. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I'm not asking you to forgive me, not yet. I just want the chance to be here now, to try and make things right. You deserve so much more than I gave you, and I want to give you that, if you'll let me." Clara looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with emotion. Then she sighed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice trembling, "maybe we can try. But it's going to take a lot of time, and I can't promise anything." James felt a rush of emotion, his chest tightening. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her arm. "That's all I ask, Clara," he whispered, "just the chance to try." Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening, and then she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "We can try. James felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart swelling with hope. He knew that there was a long road ahead, that there would be challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose, something worth fighting for. And he knew that, no matter how difficult the journey ahead, he would face it with everything he had. He had chosen to live, to fight for a place in his daughter's life. And now, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, he knew that this was just the beginning, a beginning filled with hope, with the promise of second chances, and with the possibility of forgiveness. And for James, that was enough. Somber adjective meaning: dark, serious, or gloomy in tone. Example: the air was thick with the somber weight of the occasion. Explanation: describes something that has a solemn or melancholic atmosphere, often evoking sadness. Rekindling verb meaning: to restart or revive a feeling, relationship, or emotion. Example: James hoped the gift would help in rekindling his relationship with Clara. Explanation: refers to bringing back something that had faded, such as a connection or feeling. Disoriented adjective meaning: confused or unable to recognize surroundings. Example: Clara looked disoriented, unsure of what to make of her father's unexpected visit. Explanation: feeling confused and unsure of where you are or what is happening. Fragile adjective meaning: easily broken, damaged, or emotionally vulnerable. Example: James looked fragile, as though he was carrying the weight of years of regret. Explanation: describes someone or something that is delicate and easily damaged, often emotionally. Reconcile verb meaning: to restore friendly relations after a conflict or disagreement. Example: he wanted to reconcile with Clara after all these years. Explanation: refers to bringing two sides back together, often after a disagreement or separation. Murmured verb meaning: to speak softly and indistinctly. Example: Clara murmured something, her voice too low for James to catch. Explanation: speaking quietly, often in a way that is difficult for others to hear. Reluctantly adverb meaning: unwillingly or with hesitation. Example: Clara nodded reluctantly, agreeing to let James try to make things right. Explanation: describes doing something despite not really wanting to, often due to obligation. Estranged adjective meaning: no longer close or affectionate to someone. Alienated. Example: he felt estranged from his daughter after so many years apart. Explanation: used to describe a relationship that has become distant, especially one that was once close. Reassuring adjective meaning: intended to comfort or give confidence. Example: James tried to offer reassuring words, hoping to ease Clara's concerns. Explanation: something said or done to reduce fear or anxiety. Thank you for watching today's story, The Midnight Train. I hope you enjoyed it and found it easy to understand. Did the story resonate with you? Was the English level clear enough? Let me know in the comments if you understood everything and if you liked the twists and emotions throughout. If you're looking to improve your English even more, be sure to watch other stories on this channel. They'll help you practice, build your vocabulary, and deepen your understanding of English. A suggested video will appear at the end of this one. Click on it to keep the learning going. I hope to see you there. Keep improving, and remember, you're doing amazing.